Hello, my name is Vanessa Davila, and today I'll be talking about memory. So, who is HM and why is he relevant to memory? So, HM is Henry Gustav Molaison, and he's a man who got a procedure done in his brain in order to stop his epileptic seizures. Unfortunately, because of this operation, he had long-term memory pretty much taken away from him. So he no longer could have new long-term memories form. And this was because he had the left and right parts of the temporal lobes removed in his brain. And we can see now that these areas of the brain control long-term memories. So HM was known as a pure amnesic patient. Now, what is pure amnesic patient? He was considered this because he didn't have any psychological disorders because of this procedure. He didn't have any speech impediments. He was actually above average on his IQ. He had a 112 and the average is about 100. So he was essentially unimpaired in anything else other than his long-term memory. So he had a neuroscientist who worked with him for years named Suzanne Corkin, and she knew him for years. However, he could not seem to ever remember her because of his inability to develop long-term memories. So let's talk about why he is relevant in memory in this discussion. So first, I want to clarify that neurobiology has defined previously that recalling things and having thoughts and memories is due to the whole cerebral cortex being engaged when remembering something. But HM's case proves this totally wrong. And why is that? The reason for that is because HM is able to recall memories from his past before he had the surgery performed. He's able to tell you about how to roller skate, how to ride a bike, just different things such as that. He's also not able, interestingly enough, to give particulars about those situations, though. So he could tell you in general form how to do something that he'd learned from before, like play an instrument, but he couldn't tell you something like, on my 8th birthday, I dropped soda on my shirt and my mom was so mad at me. And this just goes to show that there are different systems and regions of the brain that make up memory. So what I mean by that is you could have a system that's known as autobiographical memory, which is specifically serving the purpose of telling you a unique event at a specific time and a place. And there's also another type of memory system known as the gist knowledge, which is the type of knowledge we see in Henry, his ability to have gist knowledge, but inability to have that autobiographical memory. We also see that he can talk about famous people because that's, strangely enough, a hobby of his, but he's able to recall famous people before his surgery was performed, and he can tell you what their names were and what they were famous for. But when you showed him previous names or last names of people he had met before his surgery, he could identify that the name was familiar to him. However, he was unable to tell you anything about that person. So it's interesting to see how with famous people who he's interested in and has a hobby in, he can tell you about them, he can tell you why they're famous, but somebody that he'd met in his past, he could only recognize the name, but he couldn't describe anything about them, their features, their age, anything. So this just goes to show further divisions in the brain that's responsible for different parts of memory. There's also different parts of the brain that can serve different functions, such as accommodating for his ability to retain the acknowledgement of a famous person and the reason why they're famous, versus somebody that he doesn't consider as important. So it's kind of a psychological factor, also attached with an emotional factor. A lot of those famous people, what he remembered them for were emotional attachments, such as humor or violence. So we see that there are two broad categories of memory. In this example of HM, we can see that he could have this thing known as non-declarative implicit memory, where he was able to learn a skill, a motor skill, such as drawing a star, but he lacked another type of category known as declarative or explicit memory, which is the conscious recollection of facts and events. So he was only able to have one of those categories, but it does show that there's two different categories that make up memory. Also, interestingly enough, HM was able to know his home address after he had his surgery performed, and he could draw the exact floor plan of his house. So this shows that through repetition, that is a possible answer as to how we can gain long-term memory, even though in a sense scientifically he's not really supposed to have the ability for long-term memory. Yet somehow through this repetition, through this living in his household day in, day out for hours, for months, for years, he's suddenly able to maintain and retain that information about his home. So then, in a snail memory test done, there were sea snails known as Aplysia that had electrical shocks delivered to them in order to see if snail memory could learn and retain the message that the outside world is a dangerous place. In order to see if they were able to retain this information, the scientists looked at their reflexes. So when they were touched with the electrical shock, they would have the reflex of hiding their gills and siphon, so they retracted them, and they looked at periods of time of how long. So the sea snails that had never been shocked before retracted for about 11 seconds, whereas the sea snails that had been repetitively shocked over time had retracted their gills and siphons for 45 seconds, which is a major difference in time. And even when these sea snails wouldn't be shocked for longer periods of time, the moment they were shocked again, they retained that memory, that long-term memory of the world is a dangerous place, and they kept that 45 seconds, so they didn't change in pattern over time. So this is the idea that repetition, through repetition and experience, we're able to retain a long-term type of memory. So this is a great example of the human brain as well. Just like I said, experience and repetition are able to form our understanding and long-term memory of things. Also, an interesting part of the study that was done was looking at the actual neurons of the Aplysia. So they took a cell culture and they combined a sensory and motor neuron from the Aplysia into the cell culture, and they applied a shock to those neurons, those neurons, and they would see that it created a mini neural circuit system in which the communication actually changed, and they would see more signals being stronger in chemical signaling, and receiving more signals occur when they delivered those shocks to the neurons. And this was known as the short-term memory. In the long-term periods of shocking the neurons, they would notice an actual morphological and physical change of the neurons. So they saw a growth of new synapse connections between these two neurons, the sensory and motor neurons, which indicated the long-term memory. They also had a rat memory test where they found that there was a PKM zeta, which is a molecule involved in long-term memory storage. So they found that at least one of the things that PKM zeta does is to approximately double the rate of trafficking proteins that guides receptors into a synapse. So the PKM zeta aggregates postsynaptic regions of the synapse. So the synapse ends up with having twice as many receptors for as long as PKM zeta stays aggregated there. So this increase in receptors means that the next time that the sender neuron releases a neurotransmitter, the receiver neuron will have a stronger, larger electrochemical response. And we call this strengthening long-term potentiation, LTP, of a synaptic response. And we see that memory expression is essentially a replay of electrical activity that occurred when the experience first occurred in the brain. So experience changes synapses so that the pattern of strong and weak synaptic communications can be easily reproduced. So this is one way that information can be replayed in memory. So this is long-term memory. They see also in the study that repetition aids in the formation of long-term memory. Okay, so looking at psychological dimensions of memory, we see that there is not only an actual morphological change of neurons through experience, but there's also that association with long-term memory in connection with emotions. So we see that in HM, a lot of the famous people he remembered was because of emotional experiences that had occurred to them or about them, or that he found humorous about them. We see that through HM's case, they were looking at psychological factors that could have impacted him, such as things like speech impediments or aggression, any type of thing like that, whereas HM actually proved to be the opposite. He didn't have any of those problems and he was quite peaceful. So this just shows that there's various psychological aspects that have to do with memory, and that's seen a lot through HM. Now let's talk about human memory in everyday life. So we are able to see that there are complex systems that make up memory. So there's complex systems within memory, and it's not just the entire cerebral cortex or entire brain that is involved with just one function of memory. It's actually multiple different areas of the brain that have an ability to control very specific and certain types of functions of memory. And we see that through HM and his abilities versus inabilities for memory. We also see that through everything such as HM, through the snails, through the rats, important factors such as experience and repetition truly form and morph our long-term memories. So things and experiences such as getting shocked, that would create a morphological change in our own neurons and cause an actual short-term response along with a long-term response. So we would see very similar, most likely, results that the sea snails had with their changes in their cell signaling, their synapsings, and their morphological changes of their neurons. We'd most likely see that in human everyday life as well. And a lot of the times we do. So we have a lot of repetition that occurs in our lives and a lot of stimuli from the environment which create experiences. And those experiences create long-term memories and different types of responses in humans and in their everyday lives. We also see that in HM, he's able to develop this sort of long-term memory in a sense of famous people through repetition, as well as his ability to remember his exact floor plan and address of his house. Even though in theory and scientifically, that's unusual because he really shouldn't have the ability for long-term memory. But that just goes to further show that we need to do so many more studies on the brain, and neuroscientists are doing much more studies in order to find